So here we have an image of the repeal, and this was widely disseminated after the repeal of the Stamp Act. And a couple of just important concepts that are visible here in terms of the message that is being sent throughout the colonies. The print shows a popular satire commenting on the Stamp Act. The supporters of the act gather at a dock and they're carrying a small coffin containing the remains of the bill toward an open vault. Leading the procession and preparing to deliver the funeral eulogy is the Reverend W. Scott, who's followed by Greenville carrying the coffin. There are other important figureheads who are responsible for passing the act, who are represented in this image as well. Quantities of unshipped cargoes destined for America have accumulated on the dock during the time when this was in force. So there are some important messages being sent here. One, this really demonstrates the success of the colonist efforts to resist the Stamp Act, and certainly emboldens them and encourages them to sort of keep up the good work in resisting this type of oppression and influence from Great Britain. Now, almost immediately after the repeal of the Stamp Act, Parliament passed what was known as the Declaratory Act, which affirmed its political power over the American colonies. Following the Declaratory Act, the colonists entered into a period of relative calm. But in June of 1767, Charles Townshend, who was the new prime minister, advocated for a new tax. This new tax would be along the model of the Sugar Act. The Townshend Act imposed an import tax on certain goods that were sent to the colonies, including glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Unlike the earlier indirect taxes, which had occasioned little popular protest, the Townshend Act immediately prompted dissent. Samuel Adams wrote a circular letter prompting a boycott of the taxed items, and the Massachusetts Assembly sent his letter to all of the other colonies. To ensure that the duties were paid, Parliament stationed additional troops in Boston and New York City. But the colonies did not back down. Colonial leaders urged a boycott of all British goods. Women were extremely important to the success of the boycott because women were responsible for purchasing the household items that were targeted by the boycott. Women were expected to forego a wide variety of British goods. Female shopkeepers were expected to participate in the boycott alongside male merchants. Women and girls began producing homespun cloth and herbal tea to replace items on the boycott list. Colonial women supported the boycott by organizing spinning bees and producing ample amounts of homespun cloth. They wore homespun and demonstrated their adherence to the colonial cause. Wearing homespun was sort of a badge of honor because it was a visible symbol that others could see that you supported the colonists against this oppressive tax from Great Britain. In February of 1770, 300 elite women from Boston pledged to boycott tea. Other women agreed to join the boycott. The spinning bees and the tea boycott were part of an orchestrated effort to make Boston the center of colonial opposition. Propaganda produced between 1769 and 1770 made clear that Bostonians rejected Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Confrontation between the colonists and British soldiers continued into 1770. In addition to being very angry over the import tax, many colonists opposed the British soldiers because those British soldiers took additional jobs to supplement their military salaries. This meant there were less jobs for men in Boston. Violence erupted on March 5, 1770, in Boston, when 1,700 British soldiers were stationed in the city of about 18,000. Now, there were some young boys who were throwing snowballs at a lone British sentry outside of the Boston Customs House. Now, this act of these boys throwing snowballs attracted the attention of those in the area, and a crowd began to form. The sentry called for help, and Captain Thomas Preston and another 7 soldiers responded. Although Preston appealed for calm, the situation began to escalate. More and more projectiles were thrown, not just snowballs, and eventually a gun was fired. Shortly thereafter, the soldiers fired into the crowd and killed 4 people spot on. 11 others were injured. There was confusion about who, if anyone, gave the order to fire, but the colonists were outraged, and leaders like Samuel Adams recognized the propaganda potential in labeling this shooting the Boston Massacre. Adams organized a mass funeral for those who were killed. After 6 of the 8 soldiers involved were acquitted in a subsequent trial, colonial protesters were even more convinced that Britain was being tyrannical and this excessive use of force by Great Britain must be opposed. Committees of correspondence formed again to spread the news of the Boston Massacre. These letter-writing groups were vital links between the colonies and allowed for the coordination of protests and, importantly, the dissemination of information. They also circulated Paul Revere's engraving that showed the British soldiers firing upon unarmed, peaceful crowds. Responding to the pressure from merchants on both sides of the Atlantic, Parliament ultimately repealed the townshend duties on everything except for tea. In addition to the protests against British taxation, there were protests against authorities closer at home. The tenants in New York and New Jersey continued their protests against their landlords. The regulators in North Carolina were viewed as traitors by William Tryon, himself a protester against British taxation. The regulators claimed that they were only trying to protect ordinary colonists from deceitful and corrupt officials and their employers. When Tryon sent troops to put down the rebellion, as he said, the regulators responded with an army of 2,000 farmers. In what was known as the Battle of Alamance Creek in May of 1771, 20 regulators were killed and more than 100 were wounded. 6 of these regulators were later hanged in front of their neighbors and the colonial officials. The battle was not proclaimed a massacre, but many farmers deeply resented the governor and the colonial officials. An independent regulator movement also rose in South Carolina. A few years later, in 1767, the regulators established control over the western part of the colony and set up their own judicial system. In 1769, they were able to negotiate terms with the colonial government that provided the frontier areas with more political representation and government services such as a court system. Now, this is a very interesting dynamic that is taking place. We see that colonists, both wealthy and poor, are beginning to view Great Britain as, at minimum, oppressive, but perhaps even tyrannical. But at the same time, Many of the poor colonists, the working colonists, are also very distrustful of the wealthier colonists who they believe are somewhat akin to the wealthy, more distant British people. Now, the calm that followed the Boston Massacre lasted only until May of 1773, when Parliament passed the Tea Act. This act granted the East India Company a monopoly on exporting and selling tea in the colonies, but it did not increase the tax on the tea or the base price of this commodity. The East India Company's monopoly created a new alliance between the merchants and the radicals like Samuel Adams, as colonial merchants would be excluded from the profits of selling English tea. Adams and others had refused to pay the original tea tax and kept up this support through their committees of correspondence and Adams' Rights of the Colonies, which was a widely circulated list of grievances against British policy. The committees of correspondence quickly mobilized to prevent the sale of tea. In some cities, tea was unloaded but never sold. In others, ships were refused permission to land. The most famous protest occurred in Boston on December 16, 1773, as members of the Sons of Liberty boarded the East India ships anchored in the Boston harbor and dumped 45 tons of tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party directly challenged British authority in the colonies, but no one was willing to identify the perpetrators. Parliament responded in 1774 with the Coercive Acts, which closed the port of Boston, gave royal officials more power in Massachusetts while reducing the power of local officials, moved trials of royal officials from Massachusetts to England, and forced Boston residents to quarter British soldiers in their homes. The coercive acts, which the colonies called the Intolerable Acts, were intended to stop further protests, but they did just the opposite. News spread throughout the colonies, and armed groups of colonists known as Committees of Safety joined the Committees of Correspondence in vowing resistance to British policies. Other colonies came to the aid of Boston and the colonial leaders, who were now calling themselves patriots, recruited colonists of all ranks and classes to uphold the boycott of British goods. In early 1774, patriots meeting in Williamsburg, Virginia, called for delegates from the colonies to meet at a Continental Congress in Philadelphia that September. The coercive acts were supposed to quiet the conflict between the colonies and Great Britain, but they merely raised it to a new level. Colonists came together across socioeconomic lines to completely boycott all British goods, and many colonists decided to oppose British policy with force. Now, the Continental Congress convened in September of 1774, and delegates from across the colonies met to discuss the individual colonies' relationship with Britain. Men who had collaborated on earlier protests but represented a range of views came together to resist what they viewed to be parliamentary infringements on their liberty. The colonists agreed to continue the boycott of British goods, and argued that Americans should control their own laws. The Continental Congress represented unity among white, wealthy males who supported the views of the colonies and believed that they represented the colonies. They do this, of course, without addressing any issues of race or class. Here we see the Edenton Proclamation, and a couple of things to sort of make note of here is that we see some of those women are privileged and some are more middle class. The one in the upper right looks like an unmarried woman or perhaps a widow, and the author might be suggesting that the colonial women truly have no sense of propriety. Other important concepts that are visible is we see a man who is making a pass at the woman who looks sort of seductive. And this is suggesting that the author thought American political life was decadent. The man's centrality in this image suggests that women's activism was influenced by men, and therefore it was really bogus, that it wasn't something that women truly partook in. We also see a bit of chaos in that we see children, we see this dog, we see a lot of different people who are represented in this Edenton Proclamation. And finally here, this is the etching of the Boston Massacre. And this, of course, made by Paul Revere, is really certainly a stark contrast to what actually took place. But because it was so widely disseminated, it really inspired and encouraged that anti-British sentiment and this notion that the British Army is really the forceful arm of Parliament here to bring these colonial subjects under rule by whatever means they believe to be necessary. This brings us to the end of Chapter 5. Thank you.